The Mutual Broadcasting System presents STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. With today's briefing, here is retired Marine Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT. And our Strategic Risk Assessment Talk is going to kind of go back to a topic we've hit a few times, which is obviously the Russo-Ukraine or war in Ukraine, the conflict there. And I'm going to touch on something I've talked about before, which is the deep strike program across Russia. But I'm going to specifically get into how this is upending Putin's position and threatening his regime in ways that I think a lot of us may not appreciate. You know, so many times, it's always brought up, and it's kind of armchair warfare analysis or whatever. It's like, well, they've been doing deep strikes for a while. Well, there's been a lot of predictions of Putin's demise at some point, and it hasn't happened yet. And same thing with Iran. It's like, they put the economic sanctions on Iran before and they didn't collapse. And I would kind of go back to the famous Roman phrase, when the Roman legions were wiped out in Germany, where the Roman commander was rumored, or at least he was killed, so it's not like he could confirm it. But his last words were reportedly not like yesterday, meaning that the way that they had defeated the German tribes previously wasn't working. All right. And I kind of think about that with Putin. At some point, Putin's regime will end. All right. And at some point, Iran's autocratic theocracy will eventually end as well. That is kind of the march of history. These things don't last forever. So eventually it'll be true. I've been seeing for a while predictions saying that 2026 could be a very decisive year in the Russo-Ukraine war, that Russia was running out of steam economically, and certainly everything seems to indicate to that point. But during the last few months, Ukraine has been doing this extensive program of deep strikes with drones and missiles across Russia, even into western Siberia on the other side of the Ural Mountains. All right, this is stretched. It's a very strategic way of looking at this. Ukraine only has so much air defenses, and a lot is said about that and their inability, right now with the shortage of Patriot missiles, their inability to stop Russian missiles from coming in. And so much has been said about that. Well, there's a lot to be said about Russian air defenses too. They've only got so many air defenses. They are stretched thin around the country. Putin has been pulling air defenses from very strategic locations, places where they have nuclear weapons. He's been pulling air defenses that by all rights should remain in place, and pulling those back to covering cities and oil refineries and all sorts of stuff, because he simply doesn't have enough. And Ukraine knows that, and they have been very systematically exploiting that weakness across the board. They have been sending their drones and missiles, in many cases, to precisely the places where they have the most chance of causing the most amount of destruction and the least probability of being intercepted. This has had an enormous impact on the Russian economy and particularly Russian society. It is really tough to overstate just how big this has been. And it is truly a strategic inflection point for Putin. Numerous reports are circulating that Putin was going to do some sort of military provocation very soon against a NATO country or potentially NATO countries, just to shift the narrative within Russia. This is being done externally, strictly for a domestic audience, if you will. It would give him a way to say the conflict has been broadened. And he has always claimed that this was NATO, even though Ukraine is not part of NATO. He said, Ukraine was going to become part of NATO, and NATO was threatening Russia and all this other stuff. Anyway, this would be a way to go back to that talking point, as we might say, that somehow NATO is the big threat, and he could point to that. And he needs that right now because he's losing. He's losing the war in Ukraine. He's making losses on the battlefield, if you will. He's losing more terrain than he's gaining. He's incurring phenomenal losses in troops and equipment. but particularly troops that he can't sustain. They can't recruit enough troops to offset in Ukraine the number of troops that they're losing on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. They can't do that. So he's stuck. So he's now forced to do something he's been avoiding for years, which is to order a mass mobilization across Ukraine or across Russia, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 to 500,000 troops. He doesn't want to do this because he knows to order that is to tacitly admit that this is not a special military operation, that this is a full-scale war, and it's a war where Russia is losing, and he doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to be perceived by the Russian people as a loser. He doesn't want to be perceived as weak, and to do this mobilization would make him look very, very weak in the eyes of many Russians, particularly the elites. So he's been trying to avoid this mass mobilization. The only way he can really avoid saying this is because of Ukraine is to find some other pretext and to attack a NATO country, to incur some sort of action by NATO would be what would give him that fig leaf, at least he thinks it would, to justify mobilizing Russian troops. The damage on critical infrastructure is so great throughout Russia that it was just announced that he's planning to nationalize core components of critical infrastructure around the country, ostensibly to protect them and to help in rebuilding or fixing them. But doing this really represents a massive reallocation of wealth, land, assets, buildings, whatever. This is a massive reallocation of wealth to the Russian state. And this is going to financially damage. For some, it's going to financially gut some of the same oligarchs that he's relied upon to stay in power. So it's another risky move that he's making at this time. It's also one that he can justify better if Russia is embroiled in a larger conflict against NATO or a NATO country, as opposed to the current situation, which is just losing the war in Ukraine. And I mentioned Ukraine as population-wise, certainly is about 1/3 the size of Russia, so he has no excuse there. The Putin plan is so dangerous that CIA Director Ratcliffe flew to Moscow yesterday, as I'm recording this, or the day before, and in a C-17 aircraft that was caught on video going in. And it's like, why is a U.S. Air Force C-17 flying into Moscow? And there were reports that we had asked the Ukrainians to halt drone and missile strikes throughout much of Russia, certainly St. Petersburg, Moscow, the airports, so the plane could get in there and out of there. And this was to, ostensibly to deliver a message to Putin, which is reportedly that we know what he's planning. We know what he's planning to do, and to warn him in very blunt, stark terms, don't do it. Whatever you think you're going to accomplish, it isn't going to be what you think. It will fail. So what this means is that Putin and Putin's regime is in pretty desperate straits. Every day, massive fireballs and plumes of smoke, dark clouds cover major cities, refineries, distribution centers, warehouses, arms plants, arms caches, military bases, critical infrastructure all over Russia are being destroyed on an increasing level every single day. And it's not just that they're seeing the destruction, it's also that Russia has less and less ability just because of the sheer amount of destruction, they have less ability to fix, to restore these things that have been destroyed. And so it's fairly effective strategy that Ukraine is using in this regard. It was reported that Putin's recent trip to Siberia and all the way about as far as you can go to the Kuril Islands. Those are the islands, Japanese islands, but northern Japan, that the Soviet Union seized at the end of World War II, that they've never given back to Japan. Putin was all the way out there, and it made people scratch their heads, and there was a lot of speculation. It's like, okay, he's firming up his focus on the Pacific and firming up his, association with China and Pacific objectives and all this other stuff. That was all very interesting speculation. There was another thing that came out, though, and it was widely rumored that he had literally fled Moscow and fled as far east as he could to get out of range of Ukrainian missiles and drones. He was afraid that they were going to target wherever he was, and it went so far that he actually had created what appeared to be pretty much sets in the Far East to make it look like he was back in Moscow doing his work or back in the Kremlin, when in fact he was actually in Siberia, and they created the backdrop to make it look like he was actually back in Moscow. So very interesting to hear that. And that tells you something about how he was so personally concerned or afraid of what could happen to him. And really, if you look at this, at no time since World War II has Russia and its major cities been under such military peril. And average Russians over the last several months or few months have finally been feeling the strain and pain of this war in very stark terms. The fact that there's things blowing up around them. They see the fireballs, they see the smoke, they see the damage, they see the disruption. But also it's become very difficult for them to acquire basic necessities such as gasoline so they could drive to work. A lot of the supply chain stuff, particularly hitting wild berries and Ozom, another online retailer, this has caused major disruption of moving stuff around Russia as a whole. It's disrupted the supply chain, and for many, they're reminded things that just how bad it was way back when. On August 16th, Russia did something that caught my attention. They announced that they had shot down 800 Ukrainian drones overnight. That would appear to be one of the largest, or maybe the largest, Ukrainian airstrikes on Russia to date. And by the way, if Russia is admitting that they shot down 800 drones, which they will always overstate how many drones they've actually shot down, but just by admitting that, it makes you wonder, well, how many drones did Ukraine actually launch? I mean, obviously it had to be over 800 or Russia wouldn't have admitted publicly that they shot down 800. That would be a massive onslaught of drones across Russia. And it makes you wonder, well, maybe was it over 1,000 drones? It really is interesting to see that. And that gives you an idea of, they're producing millions of drones every year. Ukraine is, and it makes you wonder just how many drones did they fire across around the country. All right, that is and it does reinforce the impression, or at least the understanding, that Ukraine has an amazing ability to consistently produce drones, high quality drones that can do deep strikes, launch these drones and missiles against Russia, and effectively overwhelm their air defenses. Reports are that Russia is also targeting air defense systems directly. Putin has a big palace, for lack of a better term, that sits on the Black Sea. During much of the war, he would hide his significant other, his I don't know if she's his legal wife, but his de facto wife and its kids would be down at this place. And it's one of his favorite places to vacation or to be away from Moscow. And it was being protected by S-400, the most advanced air defense systems. Ukraine went in and wiped out the S-400 system. And I thought that was brilliant because they didn't destroy the palace itself, but they've made the palace completely unusable for the time being to Putin and his family, because they can't go down there safely without putting themselves at risk of an airstrike. And there's nothing that would stop drones or missiles from hitting that place now. I thought that was smart, but it also reinforces an Achilles heel, which is he's having to move these advanced air defense systems around, taking them away from strategic areas. I mean, what do you do? Take an S-400 away from Moscow and move it down to his palace and leave parts of Moscow, take it away from the other places like where they're producing Russian drones or Russian missiles, or where they store them or launch them. It really was a very smart move. It has, beyond the military effects of what they're doing, it leaves large areas of Russia defenseless against drones and missiles, and that has a huge psychological impact, particularly over time, as Russia is unable to stop these Ukrainian drones and missiles from coming in. And that is the most basic social contract any government has. It's to protect its people. And at this point, Putin would be in a situation where he can't protect his people. For Putin, these are really desperate times. And reports that come within Russia, that the Russian elites, this for months, for certainly go back to June, I go back to May, that they had become very frustrated with Putin. There was certainly insinuated that they were looking for other options. Obviously, if Putin finds out about any particular member of the elites, any particular oligarch planning his untimely demise, he will definitely go out there proactively and try to eliminate that oligarch in the old-fashioned way. But he can only do that so much. You can only eliminate so many elites and oligarchs, where pretty soon you run out of support with any of the elites and oligarchs. The Russian GDP is shrinking. How much per year is a question. I think I've seen numbers that say it could be shrinking by a few percentage points. I've seen maybe up to 6 percentage points. And actually, some of the revised numbers say it's been shrinking for years. It's just been all kind of smoke and mirrors, some creative math to make it look like it wasn't shrinking. It was interesting to me how much of the Western media was picking up on this fact, and how many were saying, well, Russia, despite everything that's being said, their economy is still growing and stuff like this. I was looking at this and go, I don't think it's growing. And certainly if you look at the sheer amount of destruction that's happening now, there is just no feasible way that you could say the Russian economy is growing. So these mounting costs, potential sanctions are threatening Russia's ability to sustain the conflict. The demands of the military have depleted the labor pool across Russia, and now he's looking at mobilizing 300,000 to 500,000 more troops, which will deplete that more, which means that basically, and factories are literally shutting down because they don't have workers. So Ukraine's been very effective in how it's doing. They've been hitting Wildberries facilities. I know I talked about Wildberries a while back. That is when all the Western companies pulled out, this was kind of their version of Amazon, and it has become more and more something they rely upon in order to move stuff around. Of course, the Russian military started relying upon Wildberries as well as a military logistics asset, so it was a dual-use facility, certainly a legitimate target under the international laws of armed conflict. But it was leveraged to the hilt, and much of that tied to banks that are owned by the Kremlin or controlled by, or basically owned by the Kremlin. And so when you're seeing Wildberries wiped out like this, and they were already over-leveraged, the question, where does the money come to rebuild all these warehouses? How do they get that? There is no magical insurance thing within Russia that's going to fix all this stuff. And if you look to the banks are already over-leveraged with the war. I mean, when the head economist for the Russian government is talking about that they can't afford to do the war and saying so publicly, which is what just recently happened, it tells you just how bad these things are. So they've been hitting that. They've hit a rival of that Wildberries called Ozon. But between the two, Ozon, I'm sorry. But between the two, what it's doing is these are the two fastest growing segments of Russian economy, and now they're not growing. In fact, they're going quite the other direction. And so the Russian economy is falling apart. It's definitely not, it hasn't been growing for 4.5 years. And it's clearly now they're saying it's shrinking and it can no longer afford the war. And as I mentioned previously, Wildberries was over leveraged. So taking this out could potentially trigger a banking crisis with banks owned by the Kremlin, which could spiral into a massive financial crisis across Russia. The thought of Russians making a run on the banks and the banks not having anything to pay the Russian people or to refund, to allow Russian people to withdraw their money. This is a real reality. This could turn into a complete collapse of the Russian financial system. That may sound a little bit like, wow, I don't know if that's going to happen. It could happen, and and depending on how these things go, it could happen sooner rather than later, because Wildberries, they're not rebuilding all those warehouses. It's just going to get worse and worse for them. And at some point, Wildberries becomes something they have to write off, and that is a huge loss on the balance sheets, and that's not quite sure. And what's happening is that Putin can't hide what's happening to all of these different parts of society. particularly when Moscow and St. Petersburg themselves are being hit. Now, will Putin shoot for peace? I don't really see that happening. Will he try to escalate? Well, that's why CIA Director Ratcliffe, ostensibly flew to Moscow in the middle of this war, was to tell him, knock it off. All right. So what that means is that the only way for the Russian people and the Russian elites and the oligarchs to end the war, more and more, they're going to be looking at it going, the only way to do this is to end the Putin regime. And that's going to become more evident over time, that will be the only way to do it. And if he triggers this mass mobilization, he may trigger the very things that force them to say it's time to end the regime. August in Russian history has always been a rather bleak month. Bad things happen to Russian leadership and regimes in August. I'm reminded of the attempted coup against Gorbachev in August of 1989. It failed. It was hardliners trying to reassert control to stop what Gorbachev was doing, but it failed outright. But the political done to Gorbachev was such that eventually his regime failed in December, and that was the end of the Soviet Union, which effectively ended the Cold War. I'm wondering if this might be similar, that what's happening now in August is so damaging. August, I would say going into September, is so damaging to Putin's regime that it's really just started the clock ticking on what will be an inevitable end state for it. And I'm wondering if that's already begun. Certainly no one in August of 1989 said, the Soviet Union will collapse in December. But that's exactly what happened. Putin has avoided doing this mass mobilization thing for years because he recognized what would happen in Russian society if he did it. He'd recognized that his house of cards, so to speak, would start to collapse, that the facade that this was a special military operation, that Russia was winning and everything, would be laid bare. And the Russian people have had to absorb about 1.5 million Russian men killed or seriously wounded in the course of the war. This last month was the highest number of recorded casualties, about 43,000 casualties, Russian casualties coming out of this war in July. And with that, on average, about a third of those are killed outright. Many of those go into the Russian medical system. They're not reported as KIA or killed in action, but once they get to the Russian medical system, they tend to not fare well. If they don't die over time, they tend not, let's just say they don't have the great rehabilitation system that we have in the United States. Ukraine's strategic gambit appears to be working, and in many ways is changing the very nature of warfare. And in the coming months, this may prove to be probably the most momentous we have seen in this war so far. I'll leave you with a great strategic irony. The military economic, social effects of these strikes, and particularly the interrupting the supply chains, what Ukraine is doing to Russia, is, if you kind of examine it, fundamentally very, very similar. Philosophically, I would say maybe very, very more similar to what the U.S. seems to be now pursuing against Iran. We've kind of curtailed a lot of the kinetic strikes, and we've declared this economic D-Day, but we've already delivered a lot. Estimates are that over half the Iranian GDP has been destroyed over the course of this war. I think 57% was the number that I heard or read. And now we've looked at, we said the naval blockade is having effect. If we can tighten all the screws, we've got Dubai and the UAE cutting off that back door for financial transactions, dealing with international trade. We're putting pressure on certainly Turkey to do the same. We're going to try and do something, put pressure on China. I don't know how well that will work, but we're trying to cut off all those ways that revenue can go into the Iranian regime and dramatically shrink their economy. They can't stop their ability to rebuild the economy. That sounds very similar to what Ukraine is doing, although they're doing kinetically, throughout Russia. I think back when President Trump started his term, there was that famous meeting in the Oval Office with Ukrainian President Zelensky, where it turned into a bit of a shouting match. And President Trump famously told Zelensky, you have no cards. Well, I find it interesting that in the course of events over the last couple of years, the cards that Ukraine is so deftly playing against Russia now with the deep strikes and all the economic, social effects, psychological effects, everything it's doing there, looks to be about the same hand of cards that the U.S. is trying to play in Iran, and at least in terms of effects-based approach. So I just find that rather interesting to see the U.S. goes from saying you have no cards to, hey, mind if we play the same hand of cards in conflict we're involved in? I just find that rather fascinating when you think of that strategically. Hey, thanks for listening to Strat. Also, please visit stratpodcast.com. You can go to my YouTube channel, Hal Kempfer TV, where you can see all the things I do on media all the time. And you can also go to the Global Risk Intelligence and Planning website, www.gripsa or gripsa.com. And hopefully you can see more and hear more about what's going on around the world, and maybe even hear my assessments and thoughts on what's happening with a variety of conflicts and other strategic things happening worldwide. Thanks again. Hope you tune in next time.
Strategic Risk Assessment Talk is presented by the Mutual Broadcasting System. Stay informed on the matters we discuss by visiting stratpodcast.com and other sites mentioned by Hal Kempfer. You may interact with the show through our website at stratpodcast.com or through our Facebook social media site. Thank you for joining us.